So it's interesting with photography, the extent to which some of the great photographers, particularly the great women photographers of the Victorian era, began just with taking the sort of photographs that someone would take of family members and friends and so forth. And it's through that becoming interested in more ambitious photography. And that's the case with Beals. So it's interesting to look through her photographs and to see the kinds of exchanges, the intimate exchanges that photography enabled, taking photographs of loved ones or friends, posing, performing for one another. And these kinds of exchanges within the homes of that era were a very important part of social life. What was unusual about Beals is she then took the next step, and she became a photojournalist, which is not something that very many people did, much less very many women did. And that's rather extraordinary. But one sees, even in her later work, there's always an interest in the quotidian, in the everyday, in what she can see in a gesture or an expression, much of which undoubtedly goes back to those early years of handling photography the way that many people did in middle-class homes. So Beals had extraordinary range as a photographer. If you go through her photographs in the archives, you discover that she took many photographs of animals. She took photographs of people doing amateur theatrical performances. She took street photography. She took ethnographic photographs at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. She did architectural photography. That range is quite unusual. A number of photographers, including some great female photographers of the 19th century, were much more limited in their range. To take one example, Julia Margaret Cameron, by most accounts the greatest Victorian photographer, stuck to a very limited range of photographs, and she just went very deep in each of those genres. Whereas Beals had a much wider scope and looked into many different things to photograph, many of which we can relate to now. In our moment in which cat pictures abound on the internet, it's wonderful to go through some of the photographs in the Schlesinger and see her remarkable capacity to take photographs of her feline friends. It's inspiring the extent to which one sees in the photography of Beals her self-consciousness. I mean, there's many photographs in the archive that are of her. And whether they were taken by someone else or whether she set up the apparatus and just had someone open and close the shutter, we don't always know. But she clearly took herself and her performance in the world very seriously. One of my great interests in the history of photography is in its materiality, and in particular, its openness to accident. This was understood by practitioners of photography from very early on, that here was a way of making pictures in which chance played a role that was different than the role it played in drawing or painting or other more traditional media. So whenever I'm looking at photographs, I'm also thinking about how the practitioner in question handled chance and these issues of materiality. There are signs in the archive that Beals was actually very sensitive to these issues. There's a rather marvelous picture that she took of a sitter named Leal Whitcomb Davis, who is sitting with ceramics tools in front of her on a table before a window through which light streams. And she's glazing a piece of pottery. And what I love about this photograph is the self-reflexivity of it, insofar as pottery and photography have some very significant commonalities. First of all, you have the play of the glazing of the pot and the glazing of the window through which the light streams, which is calling up the operation of photography and the way that light streams into the camera. But also in both photography and pottery, you apply this film to this object, you stick it in the dark, and then out comes something that was to a certain extent unpredictable. And every potter has experienced that, and every photographer has experienced that. And I think in this beautiful, quite exquisite photograph, she brings this dialogue to the fore. One of the aspects of Beals' photography that I think is very important to register is her social conscience. And there's one photograph in particular in the collection of the Schlesinger Library that really brings that home for me. It's a photograph of a dim alleyway in Washington, D.C., with dilapidated homes on both sides. But as you look down this stretch of very unappealing roadway, you see at the end of it rising up the dome of the U.S. Capitol, all sparkling in white. And it's that contrast between the lived reality, the material conditions of some of the more dilapidated quarters of Washington, D.C. on the one hand, and then this symbol of national might on the other, that I think clearly speaks to a social conscience about the state of affairs in the world in which she was living.